I'm going to be talking to Janetta McKenzie, who is a senior analyst with the oil and gas program at the Pembina Institute, and she's a co-author of a new study, Survival of the Cleanest, Assessing the Cost and Carbon Competitiveness of Canadian Oil. So welcome to the interview, Janetta.
Hi, Markham. Thanks for having me.
This is really interesting for a number of reasons, but one is that just last week, the International Energy Agency released its own very comprehensive study about the implications of the rapidly accelerating energy transition on the global oil and gas industry. And it said, frankly, that after 2030, if some of these companies don't have a pivot into something low carbon, we're going to see failures. We're going to start seeing stranded assets and so on. So it seems like your study is right. It just is, that's kind of good background for this. Maybe what you could do, we could start with, is just an overview of your study, please.
Sure. And the IEA report and our report, Survival of the Cleanest, do very much talk to each other and are talking about similar types of things. We know that the energy transition is accelerating and it's gaining momentum every year. And the oil and gas sector's ability to reduce emissions and to compete on costs will come under more and more scrutiny as that demand for oil peaks in the near future and then begins to decline. So as we find in this report, carbon competitiveness, emissions competitiveness will matter a lot more as governments and as corporations pursue their net zero goals, not just in 2050, but earlier than that in 2030 and 2035. And we're really facing down a future in which high cost and carbon intensive Canadian oil producers will be competing with lower cost, less carbon intensive suppliers in a shrinking global marketplace.
You have a very, very interesting chart, and I'd encourage folks to go and check out your report. And it's the chart on greenhouse gas intensity and costs, and where comparison against other countries. And Canada, unfortunately, and this is primarily because of the oil sands, it's in the quadrant that is both high cost and high GHG intensity, and which would lead, we think that it would be less cost and carbon competitive than as demand falls.
Yeah, and within that chart and drilling down into Canada, we do on average have expensive to produce and emissions intensive oil. Some of our oil assets are more competitive than others and are better placed to reduce their emissions and compete globally in that shrinking global marketplace. And some oil fields have less expensive ways of achieving emissions reductions than others. For instance, the oil sands has fewer options in things like reducing methane, which is a proven low cost option for reducing emissions. Oil sands have a lot more emissions from fuel combustion, and so the path to emissions reductions is more expensive than for a conventional oil field, for instance, which can do more on methane for lower costs.
Well, let's get into some of the numbers. So in Canada, on average, and again, this is influenced by the oil sands, the average is 85 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. And and then the average cost to produce a barrel of oil would be about $30. So look at it. Here's where some of the competitors coming in. And Norway is always, and Albertans point to it all the time and go, look at Norway. Why are they still producing oil? Well, it costs them less than $15 a barrel to produce it, and their average GHG intensity is down around 9 kilograms of CO2e. That makes them very cost and carbon competitive. Saudi Arabia, which has even lower emissions and lower costs, as many of the Middle Eastern countries do. There are a lot more countries that appear to be well positioned to compete in this low carbon future than Canada.
Yeah, and the Canadian industry has worked hard over the last decade to reduce costs, and they've also reduced their emissions intensity, but their global competitors were doing the same thing. And there are some types of oil assets and some oil fields that are simply starting from a better position when it comes to reducing cost and reducing carbon intensity. And Canadian oil assets aren't starting from the best position. Again, there is a spectrum in there in Canadian oil assets. There are some facilities and some oil fields which are a little bit better placed to make those big investments in emissions reductions and compete a bit better on the global marketplace. But yeah, Canadian oil is starting behind the start line. compared to some of these other countries, including most of the OPEC producers.
Now, my impression, based on, and I've done interviews with Kevin Burns from S&P Global, who's one of the global experts on crude oil emissions intensity. But my impression from all of those years of interviews is that in the oil sands, the oil that's cheap to produce has high emissions intensity. So we're talking a lot of the older projects like a Syncrude, that kind of. But then those that have much lower emissions intensity, and there are some as low as 37 kilograms of CO2e, those are the higher cost barrels to produce. And the oil sands can't seem to find that sweet spot where it can bring emissions intensity down and have a break-even cost under $30.
Yeah, that is the really challenging thing, is we're talking about competing on sort of two different axes: is the cost, how much does it take to produce, how much money does it take to produce, and the carbon intensity and the details of that carbon intensity. Can you bring your emissions down for a reasonable investment, and how does that stack up against your costs? So that is really the key of this report and of the IEA one, is looking at that matrix, which are both really important variables as we move towards that our era of peak oil and declining demand, because more and more countries and private sector firms will be looking at that emissions intensity in addition to the cost, because they have their own goals, their own climate goals that they want to meet. So it is challenging to find the sweet spot on both of those axes.
There's another point in here that I'm making more often these days, and that is that displacement is not Alberta's biggest problem. When oil peaks and then it begins to decline, and now all of a sudden we're into demand destruction. So we go from 103 million barrels a day to 100 to 95 to 90. That's displacement. That's not the biggest problem in the short term. It's disruption. It's ever stricter climate policies. It's getting insurance. It's not getting access to not having access to capital, or if they can get access to capital, it's they pay a premium for it. It's only the biggest, the producers with the strongest balance sheets that really are able to compete for capital. And this is only going to get, it's gotten worse over the last 3 or 4 years. And it seems to me that it's only going to get worse heading into the future as investors become more and more attuned to climate risk. Is that a fair argument?
Yeah, I think that is a reasonably fair argument. And I think that another missing piece here from our conversation is the policy certainty aspect, which we hear, from investors, we hear from the private sector, we hear from the oil and gas sector, is what is the climate policy landscape going to look like in Canada in 5 years? What is the climate policy landscape going to look like from our energy trading partners? How do we prepare for things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which the EU has already implemented? Doesn't yet apply to oil and gas imports, but the EU has recently announced rules for methane intensity on their gas imports. So this is becoming more of an issue for the countries that are importing our product. So it's also becoming more of an issue for us. And I think it also, really underlines the need to get key pieces of climate policy in place, like an emissions cap on oil and gas, which can help spur investment in emissions reduction, like strong methane rules that can mean we can get at that very potent greenhouse gas in the short term for very cheap. Things like carbon contracts for difference, which can help improve the certainty of our carbon pricing system. But also to the second point, to the investor angle, as investors and as financial institutions begin to integrate metrics on emissions and carbon intensity more and more into their own decision-making processes and their own operations, firms with the lowest emissions, lowest cost, and credible paths to lowering those emissions will have an advantage.
Yeah, I see that all the time. And, you look in the oil sands, Suncor, which is one of the big 4 oil sands producers that makes about 800,000 barrels a day. It has said, look, we currently emit 29 megatons a year. We're going to cut that to 19 megatons by 2030. And they have the advantage of this big boiler that they have for making steam up in the base plant. And so they're going to change that over to gas, and that's going to really help them cut down on their emissions. The other oil sands companies are saying, well, maybe by 2030 we can peak our greenhouse gas emissions. And that just seems so out of sync with the arc of what's going on in the market globally, what's happening with climate policies globally. To think that maybe we'll get to peak emissions by 2030. You would think that they would have to do it a lot sooner than that.
Yeah, the urgency is certainly there, and that is again why key pieces of policy like the emissions cap, which really attacks that sort of short-term, those sort of short-term emissions reductions are really important. And it is time, we need to see action beyond announcements from the sector. We've heard a lot of announcements about how the sector plans to reduce emissions, but we haven't really seen the big investments. We haven't really seen shovels in the ground yet. And 2030 gets closer every year. And so the longer we wait to make those investments and to start getting at those emissions reductions as fast as we can, the better.
Well, I mentioned economist Kevin Byrne earlier, and one of the things Kevin told me in an interview was that you can see the market making tentative efforts to pilot the pricing of carbon, the pricing of emissions. And, we're not there yet. It's not going to happen, next week or next year. But the market clearly is interested in ways to do that. And it wouldn't surprise me at all, as the pressure on policymakers intensifies, that we see the market responding as well in this field. And that's trouble for the Alberta oil producers.
Yeah, and that brings us back to what we talked about kind of at the top, is that countries, importers, are getting more and more concerned about the emissions intensity of the energy they're importing. So as our trading partners get concerned about this and start putting, a premium on lower emissions oil and gas, that affects Canada. And Canadian oil, on average, again, lots of space in the Canadian spectrum, but Canadian oil on average is just starting not from a very strong place in terms of cost and emissions intensity. So when it comes to providing, that lower, those premium emissions reductions, we're just starting from a little bit behind the start line.
Yeah, and the other thing that we should point out is that the only market that Canada has is the U.S. right now. We send all of our oil that we export goes to the American market. And I was looking at the numbers the other day. Internal combustion engine sales peaked in 2018. In 2017, and gasoline demand peaked in 2018. There's all kinds of forecasters are talking about, now that electrification of transportation is picking up in the U.S. We're only maybe a year or two away from seeing peak demand in our biggest market, and that doesn't bode well.
Yeah, absolutely. And those EVs and electrification of transport is a really good leading indicator for the way that global oil demand is going, or for the way that American oil demand is going, as they are our biggest trading partner by far. And so, when you look at, again, the policy steps that the U.S. is taking to get at the electrification of transport and to promote the sale of EVs and to pass regulations that penalize, emissions intensive modes of transport or fuel burning, that speaks to where our biggest trading partner is going, and so to where the types of restrictions that the Canadian oil will be competing with in the short term. This isn't something for 2050, as you've rightly pointed out, Markham. We're seeing those trends in electrification of transport go up and up and up and up in terms of EV sales, and lots of countries and lots of private sector automobile firms have targets for 100% EV sales by 2035, including Canada, which has some zero emissions vehicle regulations in draft right now.
I'll make this point, and it's a little political, Janetta. So you may not want to respond, but there are two schools of thought here, and we've seen them clash in Calgary, actually, at the World Petroleum Congress in September. So you have the industry, you have Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta, you have all sorts of Albertans who support OPEC's slow transition model, where we'll actually see crude oil consumption grow to 116 million barrels a day by 2045, according to OPEC's latest report. And that was, Premier Smith was a very vocal proponent of that. Then you have the IEA, but supported by other forecasters like Rystad and BP and Bloomberg NEF and so on, who argue for the fast transition. And this is where you get the peak oil demand before 2030 and then decline probably in the early 2030s. And it's the predominance of the slow transition narrative and the way of thinking in Alberta that is to some extent dictating the industry and the provincial government's inability or unwillingness to speed up this decarbonization process that's so essential to the crude oil's competitiveness after 2030. So if you want to take a crack at that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll say two things. The first is that, the transition is already happening faster than we thought it would. And you can see that in the International Energy Agency's business as usual scenarios, not their net zero, not their, what are we going to be, where are we going to be if we implement all announced policies on time and in full. On their least ambitious stated policy business as usual scenarios, every year the forecast for oil and gas demand goes down every single year. It hasn't gone back up. And the second thing that I'll say is that, a more rapid transition more quickly erodes the market for oil, right? Because we have less demand for it. But betting on that slower transition effectively means you're making decisions based on a scenario in which we fail to mitigate climate change, in which we fail to get aligned with net zero. And that is not what the countries of the world are working for. That's not what the countries of the world are gathering at the UN COP conference this week to try and do. They're talking about ways to even further accelerate that transition, to make it go even faster than we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I would say that I've read the OPEC report, and there are two major glaring weaknesses in it. One is they underestimate the competitiveness of electric transportation. They just think they still believe that the only reason people buy electric vehicles is because they're subsidized, and I think that's a big mistake. And then the other one is the competitiveness of oil, and in emerging markets like Latin America and India and Africa and places like that, where they think that basically governments around the world, but particularly in those areas, are policy fatigued. They just have had enough. They can't afford it. It's very expensive, and they're going to public support for climate policy is going to wane in the future. And I think on both those fronts, it's a poor argument. I don't see a lot of evidence for that.
Yeah, and we'll be navigating little bumps along the road. No transition is perfectly linear or perfectly straight. But I think the other thing to keep in mind with those emerging market economies is the way that costs have come down for certain pieces of clean tech in the last 5 or 10 years, actually more like 25 years, much faster than we thought they would, particularly solar, particularly wind power. So again, this just speaks to the fact that the transition is gaining momentum. It's in many ways, it's not linear because it's going faster than we thought it would. And as those costs come down and the business case for the transition solidifies and becomes clearer, then that makes it a lot more attractive for a developing economy that is getting itself on a net zero trajectory or getting itself climate aligned.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, if I was in Africa and I was a policymaker in Africa and I was comparing fossil fuel-based technologies to wind and solar and electric cars and so on, the choice would be easy, and especially knowing that prices were going to continue to drop in the future. But anyway, Janetta, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me, Markham.